Ethnic Studies 3024, Introduction to Critical Sport Studies. Today we're going to discuss the development of sport in America. You should have already read Assignment 1 on D2L, the reading assignment, before starting this PowerPoint presentation. Learning objectives for today. How did folk games evolve into organized sport? What social, political, and economic factors led to the rise of organized sport? How did sport mirror American society during the colonial period, the early 19th century, and the late 19th century? Games in colonial New England. I don't really necessarily call this sport just yet without the development of rules, regulations, and sporting activities such as spectators. But there were preferred activities in colonial New England. Hunting, fishing, for example. Oftentimes very individual, not necessarily hunting groups all the time unless they were going after large game or going into dangerous areas where there could be an encounter with Native Americans. Some sports or sporting activities were banned. Animal baiting, cockfighting, pugilism, football, and card playing. As you know from the reading, football is not the modern football that we have today, but rather than kicking a pig bladder around a field. But pugilism, if you did not catch this in the reading, is more of a similar to boxing that we have today. Animal baiting is such as dog fighting, for example, and card playing sometimes involved vices such as gambling and alcohol. Quakers and Puritans desired games that promoted the following: general community welfare, military skills, economic growth, physical fitness, spiritual growth. As you can see, the right-hand column on the previous slide would not necessarily do much, if any, to help promote any of those characteristics there. However, hunting and fishing could. Hunting, certainly military skills can be gained, possibly physical fitness. Fishing, economic growth and community welfare, thus bringing fish, food back to the community. And as I said, these were oftentimes individual activities, therefore there was a space there provided for spiritual growth and meditation. Games in colonial New England. Well, these sports should be moderate and renew men for work. Puritans believed that in work ethic over games. And the Sabbath restrictions against leisure and games was very important. Today, if you know, of course, the Sabbath, the seventh day, often reserved as a holy day, is the same day that we celebrate American football. Probably the most economically robust day in the fall and early winter periods, but this would not be seen as acceptable in, of course, New England society. Restrictions on the Sabbath were important. Gentry clubs were developed for hunting, fishing, and horse racing. These clubs began to increase or create a class system in sport. There were fees to be members in these clubs. Thus, these clubs were for wealthy or well-off individuals. And European sports migrated across the Atlantic as well. Golf, lawn bowling, and skating. There were games already practiced here for centuries prior to the arrival of Europeans. Lacrosse, a Native American game, developed by the Iroquois people in what is current-day New York and Pennsylvania. 12th century development of this sport occurred that involved 100 to sometimes 1,000 men on the field. The field could range anywhere from 500 meters to 3 kilometers. And it was a 2 to 3 day event or competition that became a ritual or ceremonial ritual that was symbolic of warfare. Games in the southern colonies. Well, now we're going to see how sport and games were different regionally. In the southern colonies, you had card games that were important. Backgammon, dice, horse racing becoming important, horse racing was also becoming important among wealthy elites in the North, in Philadelphia and New York City. Class and sports in the South, well, planters associated with racetracks. And these planters, whether they were tobacco planters, cotton planters, they engaged in high-stakes gambling that demonstrated wealth in challenging economic life, and the challenging economic life of a tobacco farmer. 18th century, new fence tracks are developed, and they started to charge admission to going to these events, thus having horse racing become something that is much more for wealthy elites. Jockey clubs introduced. Races became weekly events, and races became social events for elite members of society. Plantation sports and African slaves. The first known 19 slaves that arrived in the colonies arrived in Virginia in 1619. It really wouldn't be for another 50 or 60 years later that African slaves became the official selected person to be represented as slaves. Prior to that, you had indentured servitude among white Europeans, but by the late 1600s, the preference of African slaves, Africans as slaves, became the preferred mode, and that went on for well over 200 years. But on these plantations, there were recreations as well. The autonomy of African slaves in that they created their own space and their own activities lets us understand a little more about what slave plantation life was like. Wrestling, an important event. Races, individual running races, and cockfighting. Games in the southern backcountry, these were oftentimes similar to that of plantation slaves. You had the difference, you had shooting contests, whereas African slaves did not have weapons, but dog baiting, cockfighting, and then an event known as rough and tumble became increasingly popular in this southern backcountry society. The southern backcountry, when we use that phrase, we're referring to the lower working class poor whites in the southern backcountry, not attending the affluent events of horse racing, for example. Rough and tumble, pictured here, was a hand-to-hand combat, if you will. Pardon me. Hand-to-hand combat. Not necessarily a mortal combat, however, there were deaths involved in rough and tumble, but mostly physically maiming and harming the other person, from ripping off of an ear, gouging an eye, ripping off a finger, for example. So there was certainly this rough, near mortal combat-like fighting, something that was seen as uncivilized by the wealthier elites in the South and Southern society. Now, post-revolutionary America, the 1800s, the 19th century, this is a time period where the United States transpires from this agrarian nation to an industrial nation, from being a nation of farmers and ranchers to producers of steel and eventually automobiles and these factories that lined the Rust Belt regions of the United States today. Modernity was also seen in the United States through sport. Standardization and rules emerged in the 1800s. The first official uniforms were introduced by jockeys in horse racing. Northern and southern societies clashed over horse racing, and this became another aspect of sport. Sport took on regional identities and regional supporters. Southerners were very proud if they defeated Northerners who came in to the Kentucky Derby to race their jockeys to race their horses. Harness racing surpasses thoroughbred racing by the mid-century, and thus you see the sport transforming. Post-revolutionary America and modernity in the United States can be seen in the regulation of sport. Critics of pugilism, for example, believed that boxing needed to be prohibited, that this was not civilized, this was not modern. They were critical of the unnecessary violence, that it oftentimes encouraged public disorder. There was heavy drinking involved, and also gambling occurred with these events. Agrarian nation or industrial nation? Well, by the 1850s and 1860s, the rail lines are connecting the East Coast to the West. Waterways and canals are connecting the Great Lakes region for better shipping routes from Chicago through to the Atlantic. Telegraph lines are being laid across the country, connecting the American people who are now starting to settle this western frontier. And manifest destiny is used to justify all of this. Manifest destiny, what is this? Well, it's this belief, and a phrase that was coined by John O'Sullivan, a journalist in 1845, but this belief that the United States should move westward and claim this North American continent, that should connect the East Coast to the West Coast, and this land that had been part of France, Spain, Mexico, native people, was destined to be the U.S. territory and eventually the U.S. nation. It was also believed that this was ordained by God, that this was God's will for the U.S. to claim this land and Americans to have this land. You have federal programs such as the Homestead Act encouraging Americans to move westward and giving them hundreds of acres of land if they'll improve this land within a 2-year period. The image here I want you to focus on just for a moment and tell me what you see. If we were in the class period, you would raise your hand and say, but pause for a moment and see if you can critically examine the image here, this famous image of manifest destiny. Now that you have pressed play and you've had some time to look at this, taking a look at the image, first and foremost, most students raise their hand and say they see a woman who appears to be angelic, angel-like, holding this telegraph line connecting the East Coast to the West Coast. In her hand, she's either holding a book that would indicate intelligence, or could possibly be a Bible, indicating that she is Christianizing this land. Protestantism, very important as a Christian faith by the 1840s here. And you have this westward movement of white, mostly Northern European descent men moving westward. In this image, who's also moving westward? Native people, the buffalo. Manifest destiny was used to justify the overtaking of this land, the decimation of the buffalo, and the murder of thousands of native individuals. Also in this image, you can see the darkness of the West, symbolic that this angelic Christian woman is bringing light to the West. This was all used oftentimes throughout the 1800s and early 1900s to justify racism, if you will, in this example. The idea that the civilized Anglo-American can bring civilization to what was seen as uncivilized people. Today you can also see manifest destiny all the way through the 21st century, when George W. Bush and the United States military went into Iraq after 9/11. Many of these speeches you could hear Bush saying that we were going to make sure democracy won out in Iraq. This idea that the United States continues to push their ideological belief as this superior belief can be heard in the presidential speeches of Democrats and Republicans throughout the 20th century. So 19th century United States, I mentioned this northern white European as the dominant population and group in the United States because it's important in sport as well. You begin to see rival ethnic groups in sports. Ticket sales increased when Englishmen fought an Irishman because the Irish were not necessarily seen as white. I know that's probably difficult to grasp, and that's what's important about this topic of critical sports studies, but what is whiteness? Whiteness is this idea of cultural characteristics that are identified with being white. If you look in the image here, it's a scale. It says south on the left, north on the right. On the seat on the right, the man is sitting on words that say Irish, identifying him as Irish, and the man on the left is identified as black. Both are cartoon caricatures that seem almost inhuman, The man on the right, who is Irish, is seen as ape-like. And the Irish were largely unaccepted by Englishmen in the United States because of their Irish Catholic background. So religion, very important in many of these sporting events as well. I have oftentimes students during the topic on Native American mascots challenge this topic by saying, well, Notre Dame uses an Irish, it uses a leprechaun and refers to themselves as the Fighting Irish. Why is that not discriminatory or seen as racist? Well, that was because the University of Notre Dame football team, in I believe it was 1898, played against Northwestern University in a game that the Notre Dame team was largely supposed to lose. Northwestern was dominant that year. And the Irish, largely Irish Catholic football players, all Irish Catholic actually football players at the time for the football team, defeated Northwestern. The Chicago Tribune referred to the Irish as just a bunch of fighting Irish. And it was then that the football team adopted that idea, that slogan, those mascots. They created that on their own. So there was some ownership to that. That is how that is different than a largely white high school, for example, having a mascot of an Indian as for their team. So this is how that argument can transpire and in that discussion, and we'll discuss that further into the semester. The creation of America's game, baseball. Well, the New York Knickerbockers, the first team in 1842, the rules of good sportsmanship and fines were implemented. This has a lot to do with this idea of modernizing the United States and the modernization of sport. Being intoxicated at a game, you could be fined $1. Criticizing umpires, 25 cents. Using profanity, 6 cents. I can be guilty of any one of these possibly at a Chicago Cubs game when I feel that, or better yet, the Chicago Bears when they're playing the Green Bay Packers. I may participate in voluntarily having an alcoholic beverage. I certainly do not like a missed pass interference call against my team, thus criticizing the umpire. And, well, I'd like to think that I don't use profanity, but people around me have. So, in that case, these are the rules of sportsmanship in the late 19th century that were implemented. At some point throughout our society, we've eliminated that and accepted violence, accepted intoxication, and accepted criticizing umpires and the use of profanity in sport, thus showing how the social construction of sport can change throughout time. American football. In the 1860s, rugby comes to the United States. Athletic clubs opened around the country. Football, a variation of rugby, became popular. The first official game on November 6, 1869, between Rutgers University and Princeton University. The Ivy League universities like Princeton, Yale, Brown, Pennsylvania, they were largely responsible for the significance of the rise of football through this college activity. They were the universities that had the longest tradition, and those were the universities that implemented these sports. American football began with 20 men per team, no forward pass. It was a lateral, similar to rugby. In 1892, Yale coaches limited the team to 11 players. In 1892, these Yale coaches also implemented the rule of downs that still exists today. And I throw in here that 1899 speech by Theodore Roosevelt, The Strenuous Life. This is a speech that Theodore Roosevelt gave in Chicago, Illinois, where he argued that going into the 20th century, that the United States was going to be a great nation if we depended largely on hard work and manly strife. He believed that hard work, violence, if you will, and masculinity were all together important in making the American man. He argued that a life of ease was not necessary, that was going to only be problematic for the growth of this nation, and he included women in this conversation as well. He largely excluded women from any discussion on women with sport, which was largely also not common during the turn of the century, early 20th century. But for Theodore Roosevelt, he believed that women, their right and their duty was to bear children. 8, 10, or 12 children if they could. This was the thought process of the time of gendered norms and professed by, at that time, not President, but eventually President Theodore Roosevelt. And by 1905, football had become the most dangerous pastime in America. There were 180 serious injuries in 1905, 18 deaths linked to football in high school and in college football in 1905. President Theodore Roosevelt, now at this time, 1905, called for coaches to reform the game, and coaches from Harvard, Yale, and Princeton created the NCAA. Finally, the forward pass was introduced to football, and by 1907, and football changed to become the game that was largely popular early 20th century, revered by Theodore Roosevelt because its hard, difficult, and manly environment, and thus sport in the early 20th century became socially constructed as a sporting activity largely for men, excluding women, and largely only white, Northern European Americans.